Tuesday, November 15th, 2016. Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. I like to talk about GDP. It's a statistic that supposedly measures the size of the economy, and usually people quote GDP as annual GDP growth. When someone says, oh, GDP is 1%, that means that it's growing by an annual rate of 1%. But the actual GDP number is the sum of all, of the economy. There is of course, a formula for GDP, and I've put it here on the screen for you, gross domestic product. So it's GDP, the equation is GDP equals C plus G plus I plus NX. And it says here, C is equal to all private consumption or consumer spending in a nation's economy. G is the sum of government spending. I is the sum of all the country's investments, including business capital and expenditures. And NX is the nation's total net exports, calculated as total exports minus total imports. So that's, that you add up that number and that's the size of the economy. But usually people say, oh, GDP is 2%. What they mean by that is the annual growth. And normally, if the GDP is shrinking, we're in a recession or a depression. And supposedly now, since 2009, 2010, we've been recovering and we've been having positive GDP. But I'd like to talk about a fallacy of GDP, because the G part of the equation is the sum of government spending. So normally, government, where does government get its money from? From the private sector. It taxes, people or companies in the private sector, because government doesn't produce any wealth. It's all done through taxation. So normally, in a perfect world, government should get the same amount of tax receipts as the same amount of spending. So should have a balanced budget. But we don't. In the U.S. and the U.K. at least, we haven't had for years. So you get a budget deficit. So if you have a budget deficit of 10% and GDP grows by 10%, actually the private GDP hasn't grown, because you've spent an extra 10% in government as a percentage of GDP without really having the money. So that 10% deficit, if you account for that, the 10% GDP, that's actually zero GDP growth for the real, wealth creating economy. So that's one point I wanted to put through. And that's why I think all the talk that we've been in a recovery is a fallacy. And I'd like to also compare different countries and their GDP growths. And I think it's one of the reasons why the mainstream media, the mainstream financial media and politicians, they don't understand why people are angry and why they're voting for Brexit or for Trump. They think the economy is doing well because they don't look under the surface of these numbers. I saw someone on mainstream media a couple of days ago saying, with unemployment below 5%, the economy is doing really well under Obama, but they don't talk about the fact that there's 95 million people in the labor force that are not working in the U.S. right now. They only look at the headline numbers. So one thing I like to talk about and compare today is the U.S., the U.K., and the German GDPs. And the reason I'm doing that is because today we had a German GDP growth for annualized. It came out at 1.5% in November. That's the latest annual number. It was expected 1.8%. You might think, oh, Germany is not doing really well. But let's have a look here. I'm going to start with the U.S. And what I've done is I've taken the official GDP growth numbers and I've subtracted the budget deficit from them. And in the case of Germany, actually for some of the years, I've added the budget surplus because Germany's had a budget surplus in a couple of the last few years. So I'm going to start with the US. And so I'm going to bring here, let's have a look first. First, I'm going to show you here. Hold on a second. Where is that? Well, I'm going to bring up US budget deficit since 2006. And as you can see, we've had deficits since then. It was 1.8, 2006. 2009, it was almost 10%. And the latest numbers are like 3.2%. So that's the US annual budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. And now I want to bring up US GDP growth rate by year. And I've started 2006, so you can see 5.12, 4%, 4.4, down 0.9%. In the last 4 years, we've seen 4.3% in 2013, 4.07 in 14, last year 3%, and this year is expected to be 2.5%. So what I've done is I've taken those figures and I've actually taken the GDP growth minus the budget deficit, because that would be the real growth of the productive economy. So what I get for the US is 2006, 3.3%. So not as doesn't look as good as 5.12. 2007, 3.3. And then from 2008 to 2012, we had negative GDP growth. So 2008, it was minus 4%. 2009, minus 9.7%. 2010, minus 4.14. 2011, minus 4.86. 2012, minus 3.56. And then in 2013, we had 0.21% GDP growth without the budget deficit. 2014 was a little better, 1.27, and 2015, 0.5. And this year, it looks like it's going to be around minus 0.7. We haven't had the final numbers yet. So you can see that the US has basically been in I would say, a depression since 2008. We haven't, all these GDP numbers that we've seen, if you don't account for government spending, which actually takes wealth out of the economy has been in the doldrums. So now let's have a look at the UK, because here in the UK, there's always talk about how the UK economy is doing better than the German economy, and because the GDP here is on the surface better. So let's look at the UK budget deficits. And I've got here since 2006 as well, and you can see UK budget deficits have been very big. We had 10.8% budget deficit to GDP in 2009. In the latest numbers, we've had 4.4% budget deficit for 2015. So now, I've taken the GDP numbers, and I could only get these numbers up to from 2008. So I've done the same thing that I did for the US. And guess what? Since 2008, UK GDP growth, not accounting for government spending, has been negative every year since 2008. So I would definitely say that the UK is in a depression. We haven't had positive GDP. I'll give you the numbers. 2008, minus 5.6. 2009, minus 15%. 2008, minus 8.2. 2011, minus 5.7. 2012, minus 7.1. 2013, minus 3.4. 2014 minus 2.7, and 2015 minus 2.1. And I would say that it will be negative for this year as well, because the GDP is actually not doing great and the budget deficit is growing more than people expected. So now let's go to Germany, who's supposed to be, Europe is in a crisis, European economies, don't do really well. But let's have a look at the German budget here. And I say budget because I can't say the budget deficits, because Germany has had, as you can see in the chart, since 2006, 3 years where the budget it was actually a budget surplus. In 07, 0.2% surplus, 2014, 0.3% surplus, and last year 0.7 surplus. And they're expected to have a surplus this year, or a balanced budget. So you can see the only real years there where we had big deficits were in 09 and 10. So I did the same exercise for German GDP. I stripped it of government spending, and unlike the other countries, US and UK, I've had to add the surplus to the GDP in the last 2 years, and also in 2007. So Germany, since 2006, has only had 2 years of negative GDP growth, not accounting for government spending. So that was in 2009, where it dropped by 8.8%. But in that year, the US dropped by 9.6%, and the UK dropped by 15%. So actually, Germany didn't drop as much. And then in 2010, German GDP dropped by 0.12%. But since 2011, real GDP growth in Germany, and by real I mean without government, without the G from the GDP equation, has been as follows: 2011, 2.68%, 2012, 0.3%, 2013, 0.2%, 2014, 1.9%, 2015, 2.4%, and this year it's growing around 1.5 to 2.5. So we're going to have another positive, year of German GDP growth, maybe between 1.5 and 2%, and they're going to have a balanced budget at least. So there you have it. So, this turns everything upside down that you hear in the news, in the financial news, that, the US is the economy that's doing well in the, in the Western world, and Europe is like languishing and Germany is languishing. But I would actually argue that Germany has been, with the exception of 2009, the German economy has done really well, and it's not booming, but it's not in a recession nor a depression like the US and the UK. So I guess that's why I'm the home of alternative economics and contrarian views, because I dig below the surface and I look at what's really happening, economically. And in Germany as well, they're using the surplus to bring in a lot of the refugees. That's been the German government's plan. So they're actually spending the surpluses to finance all the refugees coming in, and that's why people are angry in Germany as well. Can you imagine if they hadn't done that and actually used that money for the good of the German economy domestically? Maybe the German population wouldn't be as angry, and Angela Merkel would be doing a lot better politically. So there you have it, the fallacy of GDP, and the fact that we're actually in a depression, at least in the UK, and I would say a bad recession in the US, and in Germany I would say they're actually recovering fairly well. So if you enjoy my video, please give me a thumbs up, share it far and wide. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do. If you think I add value and you want to help and sponsor my channel, you can donate. There's links below in the description. I accept Bitcoin, BitGold, PayPal, and Patreon. I'll talk to you there later. Take care. Bye.